Welcome, everyone. We are glad that you're here, and a very warm welcome. We really appreciate everyone who has come today, and we are very thankful and looking forward to learning together during this webinar. My name is Elizabeth Gitonga. I'm a program manager with AFCAN, and really happy to be your host at the beginning of this webinar. This webinar is hosted by the Quality to Access to Services Working Group of the AU ECD cluster, as well as the Knowledge Generation Working Group. So we are very happy to be in partnership as we host this webinar, and we will have lots lined up for you. We have a great team of presenters and experts that have prepared thoroughly for us. So before we get on, I would like to just give a few housekeeping rules for all of us so that we know what to expect and we have a smooth webinar together. So I will just highlight a few things that we would like you to pay attention to. Now, as we all come in and many are coming in, of course, we will not have the time for each one to introduce themselves. So we will ask you to kindly introduce yourself on the chat box. And that means put in your name and the organization that you represent. And that will be very helpful for us as we see the diversity of people here and then have meaningful engagement. And you can also interact with each other on the chat. You could also use the chat box for question and answers. And there is a question and answer feature, and we would like you to put in your questions there. As the various presenters present, we will, as you have seen from the program, we will not have Q&A after every presenter. We will have it towards all together. And so if you're able to put in your questions, and then we'll be able to pull those out and the presenters can answer these. And especially if a question is directed to a particular presenter, a particular presentation, please put it there and say, this is my question directed to so-and-so, so that then you get the response you require. If it is not specific, then you can just leave it blank. But if it is specific, And we encourage you to have your questions specific, because that will help us move faster and maximize on the time that we have. This webinar is being recorded, and this recording will be available on the AFCAN website once it is ready and made ready and edited. So just for your information. And we have a little globe at the bottom of the screen, something in a globe shape, and we have interpretation during this webinar. So if you would like interpretation, do click on that and choose the language you would like. And also that means that during the sessions, while the sessions are primarily in English, you may find somebody making their contribution in French. Well, so in which case the English speakers would go to that globe and ask to hear in French. A reminder also to keep the mics muted unless you are called upon to speak, so that we avoid any interference. And also do remember, when you're called upon to speak, then remember to unmute yourself. That is all by way of housekeeping. Thank you very much. Karibuni sana. And as we move along, we will update you on what's expected. If you have any query or trouble, just feel free to put it on the chat. And if it's something we can support you from our end, we will jump in and support you. So we will move right into the program. We are expecting Caroline Dusabe, but we know that she's having, oh, there, Caroline, you're there. Really glad to see you. And you had dropped off earlier. So Caroline Dusabe is here to give us the opening remarks and official welcome. And Caroline is the Save the Children Senior Advisor and convener of the AU CESA ECD Access to Quality Services Working Group. And so welcome, Caroline. We are very happy to have you here, even as our host. Welcome to open this session for us.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where you're joining from. It's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you to this important meeting. Before I give my word, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Quality ECED Working Group of the ECED cluster. We exist to intensify action to improve equitable access to quality ECD services and programs across Africa. And of course, that includes also looking at childcare, because we do recognize that childcare is not only about the protection of children, but about securing their learning and development foundations by ensuring that they have stimulating and nurturing environments from as early as possible. And we also recognize that the current setting that we are working in Africa, childcare is no longer a luxury, but it's actually an urgent need. So I'm really glad to see good alignment between what you're planning to discuss and also the agenda of the working group. Additionally, we also push for improvement of quality ECD systems, programs and services, and that also includes thinking about the ECED workforce, thinking about curricula, and supporting both national and regional level attention to high quality curricula and also ECD workforce issues. I know that sometimes when people think about ECD workforce, they think mostly about teachers, but in our working group, we know that the ECD workforce is broader than teachers, so that includes the childcare workers. And at the moment, we have a huge gap in terms of capacity of this workforce, curricula that they use in terms of supporting children's holistic needs in the childcare centers. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a good forum to begin talking about these issues and strategizing together around how we can improve childcare and early learning services. I would like to say thank you to all of you for joining. Thank you to our presenters. I know and I'm very confident we are going to have a good, rich discussion. I really like the fact that we are looking at the whole ecosystem, so also including government, because in most of our countries, government is a little bit absent from the childcare space. So I'm looking forward to hear good examples of how government can be engaged in not only providing the quality oversight, but also providing an enabling environment, and also talking about the issue of equity, because currently childcare seems to be only for those who can be able to pay. So I'm hoping that with this webinar, we can begin talking about how high quality childcare services can be provided to all children, and also how childcare centers can be used to leverage services around promoting early learning and responsive caregiving from as early as possible. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to the moderator and say, enjoy the meeting, enjoy the webinar, enjoy the great discussions. And if you're not a member of our working group, I welcome you to join. The African team can provide information in the chat around how to join. Let us work together to be able to provide high quality early childhood education and development services for our children in Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you for the exhortation as we come into this webinar. And we are appreciative of the words of guidance and anticipation that you have shared. So we'll move right on. We are glad to have David Besa with us, presenting on a systems approach to childcare. I think anyone who has listened to David would agree that he is indeed very well informed in this area. And so we really look forward to his expertise as he shares with us. I'll just tell you a little about David. He's an education specialist with over 20 years experience in education system strengthening, program design and implementation, as well as sector coordination. He has worked in various positions in government, as well as non-government agencies across several countries in Africa, and has served in various committees in Africa and internationally, supporting systems strengthening in education. And he's also served as a consultant for several global donor agencies. David is currently the lead consultant at the Adara Research and Management Consultancy, ARMC, a firm that focuses on education system strengthening and human development across health, social protection, agriculture, governance, and the environment. David is a graduate of the UNESCO International Institute for Education Planning with another master's degree in systematic theology and a master's certificate in development project management. He is a husband and a father of 4. Really glad to have you here, David. Welcome and take the platform.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And welcome to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And what a great occasion to be able to share with you approaches to systems for childcare services across Africa. You may all agree with me that childcare services across Africa is one of the critical elements for the growth and development of Africa, as well as return on investment, if indeed the investments are made. So I'd like to welcome all of you, and I want to go straight into the presentation. We're going to be looking at a systems approach to quality childcare and learning, and this is very, very, very important. When we think of childcare services, we are looking at the different systems elements, though independent but interrelated, towards achieving a common goal for children across the broader spectrum of our countries. And systems interventions are focused to specific areas. So for example, there are specific areas in health, in social protection, in education, that these interventions must focus on. in terms of a system approach if we are to achieve results for children. And I like the way Danny K puts it from UNICEF. He said, I believe deeply that children are more powerful than war, more beautiful than rivers, more precious than any other natural resource a country can have. What a great statement. If anybody considers children to be such valuable components of society, then it means that they are worth the investment, no matter the cost to society. When we think of systems and quality systems, we are looking at levels. So we look at levels at the governance and policy level. We also look at inter-institutional levels. We look at institutional levels, and we also look at individual levels. And there is a quote here that talks about, in order to develop, normally a child requires progressively more complex joint activities. So you will see that there has to be the interlocking, interchanging, interconnectedness of different forms of activities, both at the policy level, at the interinstitutional level, at the institutional level, as well as the individual level, to ensure that results are achieved for children. Now, when we want to look and dissect the different levels of the system, when we look at the governance and policy level, we are looking at the enabling environment, the policies, the legislations, the financing, the ratification of international protocols, the right systems and structures for leadership. That's what we refer to as the enabling environment. However, there often seems to be challenges across many of our member states when it comes to having the right governance and policy environment. Some of the challenges include limited political will, because you see, human capital investment is not often attractive for political purposes. Politicians normally don't use human capital investment to win elections. They look at infrastructure investments. They point to bridges, they point to roads, they point to airports. But because the investment in human capital is not that visible, but it is very rewarding. And so it is not often attractive to politicians. So limited political will often becomes a major challenge for the governance policy level enabling environment structure. Also limited public demand, limited advocacy measures, lack of institutionalized structures and systems are often challenges associated with the enabling environment governance and policy level. When we speak of the interinstitutional level, we are looking at the coming together of the different actors and partners towards specific focus area, whether nutrition, whether social protection, whether early stimulation, whatever the entry points are, we are looking at that coming together of different partners. And so that entails having shared vision, partnership, coordination, and reduction in duplication of efforts, as well as advocacy. Even at that level, there are challenges. Some of the challenges include lack of leadership for coordination and partnership. Often in many systems, there is no leadership, there's no structure, there's no system for the intersectorial coordination and collaboration. Then there are often also fragmented interventions, then limited coordination mechanisms, lack of shared vision. This often undermines the interinstitutional level to function. Then when we look at the institutional level, we're looking at strategic directions in terms of strategic plans, programs, capacity, financial allocation, service delivery. And what are the challenges? Limited structures and functions, lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities, limited technical capacity, absence of systems of accountability. These become challenges for the institutional level. And then the most important level is the individual level. We look at the services, we look at access and participation, we look at nutrition, social protection, early stimulation, early learning, health and well-being, family and parental engagement or literacy. What are the challenges at that level? Limited public demand, cultural traditional practices that are counterproductive. And in many of our countries, we have these kinds of cultural traditional practices. I'm sure you are probably reflecting on some of them as we speak on this right now. But just take a moment and think about some of those cultural traditional practices that are counterproductive. And you will realize that at the individual level, that's where the real work is. Then we look at illiteracy, lack of awareness, and limited social mobilization around these specific systems areas. So to ensure that a system approach is achieved to childcare services, we want to look at the enabling environment. When we say enabling environment, what do we mean? We are speaking of relevant policies and legislations. For example, in countries, child rights law, law on child protection, laws on families. We're looking at laws on education and the right. Looking at free and compulsory early childhood education. These kinds of policies and legislations, that's what we are talking about in terms of the enabling environment. We also look at the governance structure. Is there a structure for the intersectorial workings and collaborations to deliver the leader services? Then we look at leadership and capacity. Is there leadership? Is there capacity? Then you want to look at public investment. Are we even allocating state resources to childcare services within the national budget? Is the budget allocation for childcare services across the different sector ministries, whether education, health, gender, are they adequate? Then we look at partnership and coordination. That's where our multilateral institutions, our non-governmental organizations, local CBOs, CSOs, and then we want to look at awareness of public demand. Are people aware of these services? Are people aware of these interventions? Are they even aware that these are the things they should be seeking after? Is there demand for it? Or are there limitations or hindrances that are preventing them to even demand those services? So when we speak of the enabling environment, these are the critical elements of any enabling environment towards delivering quality services through a system approach for childcare. So what are the pathways? If we will formulate a system approach for better childcare services, then there has to be a pathway. So the pathways basically for a system approach is one, political will. At this point, that's where engagement comes in. That's where advocacy and dialogue. Without political will, there's basically going to be no strategic direction for childcare services. Also, you look at contextual planning. Are there capacity to plan? You know, planning has to be contextual. If not, most of the policies and programs will remain on the shelves. Are there technical capacity? And are there financial resources to support the plan? And financial resources often in this category are indicators of political will. So they are interrelated and interconnected. That's something that you need to think of when you look at the pathway for strengthening systems for childcare services. And here we try to describe what a system approach is. One, a system approach will provide a systematic and coherent approach to planning for childcare. It will strengthen the critical components of the enabling environment, whether policies, legislation, leadership, governance. It helps to establish a firm basis around which other work can be organized so that it becomes progressive. It also helps ministries and agencies and their partners to develop common vision that is shared and mobilization of resources takes place. One critical example or good example would be the Global Partnership for Education, where as countries develop their education sector plans and identify the funding needs and the funding gaps, and then GPE also work with countries in filling some of those gaps. But without the education sector plan, it's difficult for GPE to support the country. So that's what this is all about. Also, a system approach will help countries to design a roadmap that can guide them to the bottleneck challenges they face in delivering on the ambition to expand access to childcare services. I'll give you this one example. There was a case in Mozambique. 2 years ago, we did a national diagnostics in Mozambique and identified critical elements that were absent for childcare services. As a result of the diagnostic report, and it was integrated into their education sector analysis, they had a grant from the GPE of about 100 million. And the country decided to allocate about 40 million of the 100 million to early childhood. So once there is a shared vision, strategic planning, it creates the atmosphere and an environment for resource mobilization. While a system approach, there's return on investment. No country will lose or lost out on their investment and the return. You can see here, whether it is investment around parental support or care, there's return. Whether it's on infancy, there's return. And even the highest, whether it's on preschool, there's return. So there's return on investment of system and investment in early childcare services. That's why it is important to advocate for and, if possible, engage to ensure that childcare services become priorities of member states. What is a system approach? A system approach is an approach that is research and evidence-based. It is a holistic approach to child health and well-being, as well as literacy and early learning. It's a community-driven approach to multi-sector platforms. It bridges the gap between communities and institutional service providers. It's inclusive and equitable. It involves caregivers, system actors, parents, special needs, and communities. So it's holistic. What are the system approaches or intervention or focus when it comes to childcare services? We want to borrow in from the nurturing care framework, and we've identified 5 of them. 1 is good health, 2 is adequate nutrition, responsive caregiving, security and safety, and opportunities for early learning. If you would take a system approach to childcare services, these are 5 critical areas that you need to focus on. So this is a diagram that we created to just give you examples of services that comes out of a system approach. So a nurturing care home visit is an intervention that comes out of a system approach because it involves nutrition, it involves early literacy, early learning, family literacy. It also involves prenatal and antenatal care. So a classic example where the intersectoral coordination can exist if you were to establish a nurturing care home visit program. In Liberia, there is the nurturing care awareness that focuses on nurturing care. They've established big belly centers, and those centers also incorporate aspects of nutrition, antenatal care, and early stimulation. These are classic interventions. When you look on the far right above, where you see health services, it involves nutrition also. It involves vaccines. It involves access to better healthcare services. So there are different approaches that comes out of a system approach that links intersector ministries and agencies to delivering better services for children. Now, look at it and reflect on your own country. First, on whether there is the enabling environment. 2, whether there is the governance systems and structures. 3, whether there's technical capacity. 4, 4, whether there are inter-sectoral coordination and collaboration. 5, whether there are strategic programs that bring together these inter-sectoral bodies to deliver better services for children. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you so much, David Woods. I can't believe that all that information packed in 15 minutes. You've done an excellent job of taking us through that whole spectrum of a systems approach and giving us very rich nuggets. And as you went through that, it's quite clear this is a template that we can use when we want to look at a systems approach. David has given us what would pretty much be a template that going down that, we would be able to see what is the importance of that and how does it enhance childcare. And even the whole argument for it, showing that it really is a holistic approach that can be even framed around the nurturing care framework, and the understanding of the pathways, identifying those pathways. And I feel that once we have those pathways in place, as you have even highlighted the key areas, any organization, any community-based organization or civil society organization or country network can look and see what our realities in each of these pathways. And I like what you said about an enabling environment, because often we think about government needs to provide the enabling environment, but it's not limited just to government. What are we doing about awareness? Do people even know that this is a gap? And are we creating awareness of that gap so that then there is public demand? And that becomes also a critical piece in the enabling environment. Thank you very much, David. I'm glad that we have these sessions also recorded. I know that our participants, we like to go back and digest those things because it is very precious nuggets that you have shared there. And I'll just remind our participants, if you have a question, please use, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can use that to post your questions. And especially as the speaker is talking, if you have a particular question, do post it. And remember to indicate who that question is for, so that then it will be easy for us to follow through during the question and answer time. We're very pleased now to turn over to looking at legislation and policy framework in childcare with a focus on male involvement. And to take us through that, we have Professor Hasina Ibrahim, who is a professor, Department of Early Childhood Education in UNISA. And without a doubt, Professor Hasina is an icon in the world of research in early childhood development and education. And she has done a lot within this docket. She holds the UNESCO co-chair in early education, care and development. She is a rated researcher with the National Research Foundation, and her research coheres around the theme early childhood at the margins, with special reference to policy, practice, and workforce development. Professor Hasina has won awards and recognition for her work, including the 2017 and 2020 UNISA Women in Research Leadership Award. Professor Hasina is the convener of the Knowledge Generation Working Group in the Early Childhood Cluster in the Africa Union, and a core team member of the ECD Fellowship Program in the Africa Early Childhood Network, AFCAN. She headed national projects on curriculum and professionalization of ECD, and she is currently involved in 2 international projects on ECD systems and African-based capacity building for ECD. And she has some upcoming co-edited research-focused books, and we will encourage you to look out for those, and they're all focused on early childhood care and development. Professor Ibrahim Hasina, we are really glad to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very, very much for having me here, Elizabeth. It is certainly a pleasure to be on this platform with such esteemed guests and panel participants and presenters. And I'm going to present to you, and David has really set the stage in terms of what's, you need to know in terms of the foundational understandings of systems. And what I'm going to do is now hone in on some of those ideas with special reference to the policies and laws, so setting systems within the top level, the macro level. But then what I do is I take the case of men in childcare in Africa to engage with the issues at the different levels. And this has been work that has just been completed, and it was certainly very interesting to have a look at this particular group that is so important in children's life. And they've been marginalized in so many different ways. So what we want to do now is to mainstream men's involvement in childcare. And what I'll do is take you through the linkages and show some of the insights we gain. And then you would look at, well, how does a system approach help in thinking through this very marginalized area? Next slide, please. So basically what I want to do, and David has covered this, but I wanted to put it in context in terms of the workings. So how is the systems thinking related to policies and laws? So systems thinking is iterative learning where process-oriented moments are taken into account. So it's not just, the end outcomes thing, but as you go through, as you nudge towards the change you require, you will be going backwards and forwards and in your thinking. So systems thinking is the kind of mental models you are going to use. And so what is it that is problematic? You would have to look at what kind of view exists about the issue that you're dealing with. So in this case here, we are looking at men, and we are looking at a very narrow, static kind of view that exists that keeps men out of childcare. And so where should we be heading? We should be heading towards a broader, a more holistic, a more enabling view called the dynamic view. So that is subjected to the kinds of cultural changes that exist in society, and what that means for males and the way in which they engage with children, what it also means for generationing. For example, the older men, the younger men, who tends to take up new kinds of practices better. So the thinking is around the mental models, and the shift is from the static to the dynamic. When you go to the approaches, you are now looking at the change that is desired. And so David put it very nicely in terms of processes, methods, and gave you all the kinds of angles that shows you that the parts are, that the whole system is actually more than its parts. So with thinking and the mental models and the approaches, we can move towards things that are more affirming of quality childcare in the African context. Next slide, please. So here's a question that really helped me to think through some of the issues for this presentation and beyond. What happens when policies and laws take a static view of men in childcare in Africa? So you need to know where the problem space is. So here are some of the kinds of pointers that allows you to unpack what that staticness is. The one is and you know this well, the dominant view of childcare as women's work. If that is unproblematically making its way into policies, then it's a space for real critical engagement. What are we seeing in the African context? We see a kind of a colliding of traditional and modern practices. Both exist. How strong they are and how weak they are is a matter of generationing as well. So one of the things in the study, the literature study that was done by myself, we looked at basically the practices of patriarchy, the male domination, and the hierarchies and the rigid roles that are played out. So what it does is it assigns particular roles to males as protectors, disciplinarians, and the breadwinners, and then the female are given the caregivers and the domestic chores. Now, where the gender segregation occurs because of patriarchal attitudes, women's work for childcare is naturalized. So that's a takeoff point. But what does it do? It creates, amongst other things, gender injustice, also economic injustice, and also social and cognitive justice, because it blocks our thinking. The burden of care falls on the women, even though they are contributing to the labor force. They still have to take care of children. They still have to go home and do all the domestic chores and so forth, especially where there are rigid gender boundaries. And then what happens is it deflects attention from the roles and responsibilities of men as fathers. All right, in the pregnancy, in the birth of the newborns, and in the early stimulation, for example, in the first 1,000 days, where they are critically needed. So the static view is really problematic in terms of the family space, but it's also in the professional space. It denies institutional access for males into the early child, into the preschools, for example. And we know that we have, because of the migrant labor system, for example, in Africa and parts in South Africa, it was quite strong during the apartheid days. We have the syndrome of distant fathers. Yes, and you know, they're not absent, they're distant because they still contribute economically. So financial support is there. But what children need is emotional connectedness. And so sometimes that is incumbent upon the physical presence of men. And you can see the references there. They are all from Africa, from Kenya, from Botswana, from South Africa, from Rwanda, that these things are coming through in the literature, that the static view of men has to be engaged with, and it has to change the way society thinks about childcare through the participation of men. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I thought what I'd do is, and you've already seen this diagram here, in terms of the systems level. The centrality there is the male figure, all right, and childcare. And then if you do, I'm not going to go into all the different levels because I think that has been adequately covered. But if you do, you can see it's a hand-drawn thing. And if you do the kind of connecting the dots, you get a picture of where men are in the childcare services, where men are in terms of their participation in the family unit, where are men in terms of the institutions for children, how are they thought of in terms of the policies. And you look at the workplace as well, and what happens in the workplace, what kinds of imagery of men exists in the workplace in terms of the childcare. So the different levels and the way in which this author has presented Bronfenbrenner's development ecology gives you an indication of where the fault lines lie or where the aspects have been strengthened. And to really dig deep into the way in which the micro links to the macro, it is very important that you don't just make an assumption that this is what the status quo is like. So lots and lots of formative research. And this lies in terms of dialogue with different kinds of organizations, different kinds at community level, different kinds of participants that have what we call working theories that have not been documented. So these have to be tapped into in a way that feeds into a narrative about the way in which males currently engage as a situational analysis to navigate forward. So what is it that we are heading towards when you take this array of experience and knowledge of stakeholders from the different levels to make up a robust system that supports male engagement in childcare? What we're heading towards is a non-violent, gender transformative, and generationally sensitive approach. And when you use systems thinking and you use a systems approach, these things become possible. Next slide, please. And so what I want to go on to next is to look at, well, this is quite a large table, but I've just sliced it off just to make the point of parental support in terms of what males are doing in positive parenting. So 5 countries were compared in terms of what is happening in the policy domain to encourage men to take responsibility for children, irrespective of their relationship status. So we have fathers, not necessarily married to mothers, and we have partner status and so forth. So we take all of that into account. So a father can also be a biological father, or he can be a male playing a fathering role, and we call that social fathering, amongst other kinds of terminology that we use. But you can see, if you go, the 2 green ones are saying more or less adequate. You've got Ethiopia and South Africa, and then you've got Tanzania, that's looking at, that shows room for improvement, and then you've got Uganda and Zimbabwe. And when you look at it, you'll see kinds of wording that signals what makes it adequate, what shows room for improvement. For example, if you look at Tanzania, you can see the patriarchal views of parental roles is reinforced, right? The policy protects the child, but it reinforces the mother's role. That is because of the feminization of childcare. And so if you look at the opportunities that are lost, you move more towards Uganda and Zimbabwe. So what is happening here is there's a disconnect on the levels that we are looking at in the ecological model in terms of who men are. What do they do with children? How should we be looking at what they can contribute to in terms of enabling environments for young children and so forth. So that was just a snapshot to show you that when you use a particular indicator like enabling positive parenting and you go across, you are able to pick up which policies are weak and strong and which ones are not taking the realities into account sufficiently to promote more enabling environments for young children. Next slide, please. So the next aspect that I wanted to focus on very briefly is paternity leave. Here again, if the imagery is stripped in the mother as the caregiver and the only caregiver, then the problem is that we would not use the kinds of loopholes for parents to be enabled to spend time with their children. So the SADC country offers insight into the types of leave that is available. So we seem to be doing well in the SADC countries for maternity leave. They range from 6 to 16 weeks. But when it comes to paternal leave, it's a little bit iffy. So now we have to look at the age, the days that are given to the fathers, and they range from 1 to 3 days, with the exception of Madagascar, which had 15 days. So what accounts for this kind of a policy response to leave? And some of the answers were, it's possible that the loopholes in the SADC documentation and legislative instrument have not been sufficiently engaged with for enabling fathers to enter this particular place. So it's a new policy idea that fathers have to bond with their children. The lack of knowledge of the leave provisioning. But a study in Kenya, and this was in the private sector, showed that even though that fathers knew of paternal leave, they didn't take this type of leave. So the uptake was low. And so fathers preferred to take other types of leave. Now, why they did that is an area ripe for research again. You can look at all sorts of reasons. It cannot just be a straightforward deflecting their roles and responsibility when it comes to newborns and infants. So these kinds of snapshots that I presented thus far is a case in which the system, the policies, and the laws gives you snapshots of the issues that you have to deal with. Next slide, please. So in concluding, I think that what we are doing in the care environment is working with the change environment. And so we have to recognize that it's not just the money. And I think David drew attention to those 5 kind of areas that really strengthen systems. So it's more than the money. What are we looking at here? We're looking at doing things differently. And we are saying that business as usual is not enough. So we're looking for innovation. We're looking for integration so that we have more gender synchronized approaches for childcare, for example. We're looking at generating systems change. But these things don't happen overnight, all right? It is difficult. And as the OECD has noted, that changing the public sector in terms of an entire system is not feasible. So what we do is, and the problem there is that you cannot turn on and then just switch on. So you have to have parallel, concurrent, overlapping processes that help you to navigate through what would be the entry point, for example, for a more enabling environment for men in childcare. So you have the existing practices with the entry point of new or loopholes that allow for new things to happen. And in this case, we looked at the policies and the laws. So the systems approach provides the vehicles and the entry points for how that might happen. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sina, for building onto David's introductory presentation on systems and really bringing out important issues if systems are going to be strengthened to bring in male involvement on board. You've talked about different ways in which systems can be viewed. You've talked about the static view and the dynamic view. And from your presentation, it's coming out clearly that if you're going to achieve any success, then there's need to adopt the dynamic view, where we seek to find, a balanced ground where both men and women can participate equally in trying to contribute to childcare. And you've used the case of parental leave as a way of trying to bring this out, that even when there is parental leave, in a number of countries, for men rarely take the paternal leave. And this calls to the issue of bringing in, awareness creation, capacity building, sensitization, so that men can be able to be involved constructively, looking for innovative ways, acknowledging the fact that systems are resistant to change. And if you're going to bring about systemic change that can provide a robust foundation for childcare, then we need to be innovative, we need to be persistent, we need to bring everybody that can be brought on board. At this time now, it's my pleasure to bring to you Dr. Sheila Wamahiu, who is the next presenter, who's going to talk to us about equity in childcare. Dr. Wamahiu is the director of Jaslika Consulting. She is a researcher and an educator. She's based in Nairobi. She has a career spanning over 35 years in education, in equity and inclusion, in gender issues, and trying to link all these things to quality for all. She currently serves on various national and international boards and advisory committees. Examples include being a member of the executive board of the African Institute for Children's Studies, based here in Kenya. She's also a member of the Kenyan Advisory Committee of the Assessment of Life Skills and Values in Eastern Africa, ALIVE, and also a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Life Skills Education, among others. Dr. Sheila holds a PhD in education and a Master's of Science in Social and Cultural Anthropology. I believe a rich experience and research expertise academic qualifications, is going to bring out issues of equity that she's going to speak about. Dr. Wamahi, please take it on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wino. Good afternoon and good morning and good evening to all of you who have joined from wherever. I'm coming on the heels of two very powerful presenters, Dr. David and Professor Hasina. I think they very powerfully communicated what is a systems approach, and Professor Hasina in particular has laid the background for my talk on building the foundation of equity. Next slide, please. As Dr. Wino has said, I belong to an organization called CHILDCARE, and as you can see, in a system thinking approach, we've been talking a lot about connecting the dots and connecting the dots. And in CHILDCARE, we've been inspired by the African cosmology and the concept of Ubuntu, so that we see connections and interdependencies between the dots and generations and communities, and breaking down silos so that we can deliver the results for children better. Next slide. So in my presentation, I will quickly go through 4 sections, basically making a case for equity in the early years, and then what is an equity lens, and what is a gender equity lens, and then very quickly look at how gender equity can be embedded into the system, looking at 6 different imperatives for doing so. Next slide. Next slide. So in talking about the case for equity in early years, I will mention 2 quick facts. If you can go to the next slide, please. Two quick facts. First, it is ironic that Africa is the richest continent in terms of our natural and mineral resources, in terms of our diversity, whether it is in terms of our DNA, the genetic makeup, or biodiversity. We are the richest, but we are also amongst the poorest. In fact, Africa is second most unequal continent globally. And sadly, the poor are getting poorer. And this is even before the COVID pandemic. We've had wars and armed conflicts, violent extremism, transnational crime. Corruption eats into many of the gains that we could have made with, in terms of our human resources, because people are very hardworking, but being hardworking does not mean that they benefit from the resources that we have. According to the World Bank estimation, 87% of the world's extreme poor will be in Africa by 2030, which is less than a decade away. So we are the richest continent, but also with the poorest of people, huge inequities. The second fact is what we started this webinar with. AFCAN and other partners have been talking about it, that 2 out of 3 children in Africa live in extreme poverty. And this impact of poverty, I think the little video clip captured it very well. Talked about the inadequate nutrition, the lack of social services for family and caregiver support, which results in missing poor results in poor development outcomes, reduced productivity. And when these children grow up, they are unable to help their own children to grow and thrive and develop. And then, of course, there's the exclusion from quality learning opportunities, whether it is within the education system or outside the system. And David pointed this out very well, the inadequate resource allocation by governments to bridge the gaps in the ECD subsector. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, so what do we really mean by inequity and equity? This may sound like a simple question, but in interactions with, well, people, stakeholders from different sectors and different levels, find there seems to be some kind of confusion. So the way I'm looking at inequity is, it is a deprivation of basic rights and opportunities for certain segments, certain categories of people vis-a-vis other categories of people who are more privileged. And as we've seen in Africa, it is the majority who are being deprived of basic rights and opportunities. And the determinants of inequity are complex, interdependent, and interconnected. You have the cultural, the political, the historical factors, the historical experience that many African countries went through, the historical injustices and the deprivations, the economic and systemic factors that give one group more advantage over others. And this determines a range of outcomes, including children's well-being, and puts children at a very high risk of disease, hunger, illiteracy, and poverty, and the intergenerational transmission of these risks. Equity, on the other hand, is where all children have the same opportunities to survive, develop, and attain their full potential without discrimination. And reduction in disparities based on gender, poverty, residence, ethnicity, language, religion, or other characteristics. So that is what is equity. But as we've seen, we are far removed from equity. We are, for the most part, in the domain of inequity. Next slide. So why do we need equity? I think we need to be more equitable because it is the right thing to do. It is the moral thing to do. We don't always see it that way. We have, even in the public domain, in discussions, whether it's in the media, there's always, you see a lot of debates when there's something, let's say, for affirmative action, for a certain section of the population, you always get a pushback. And ironically, sometimes from the very same categories it's trying to address or target. Why equity? Because it is more strategic. It's a strategic and more practical thing to do because it reduces inequality and breaks intergenerational disadvantages, which means it is a win-win. At the end of the day, it is a win-win. Next slide. So now, why should we focus on early learning and early childhood? I think we're in a group of people here today who are maybe already converted, who know the value of starting very early. I'm not sure whether it's Professor Hafisa or David who said it, that the earlier we can start, the better. Because by starting early, there's the the transformational potential of nurturing care and early learning. We can transform at a relatively low cost. It looks like it's expensive, but in the long run, and there are also many low-hanging fruits that can be done at relatively low cost. So if we focus on early nurturing care and early learning, then we can transform, we can break the vicious cycles of inequity and disadvantage and poverty. And we have decades of neuroscience and behavioral science backing us up, giving us the evidence for this transformative potential. We know that investments in the first 5 years has lifelong effects. It lasts a lifetime. Children's well-being, good nutrition, health, and exercise is critical to brain development and learning. And that's the best learning happens in nurturing relationships. Can you move on, please? So now moving on to, we've been talking about why equity, but what is an equity lens? So I'd just like to spend a minute or two on this. Having an equity lens means recognizing that not all children are the same. Children can be differentiated in terms of the age, gender, ethnicity, religion, residence, socioeconomic, some places, caste and race as well, and there are other characteristics. But we must also consider that children, a child who's 5 years old, let's say in an upper class family in Nairobi, is not the same as a child who's 5 years old in a remote place in Turkana, in Kenya, which is a remote county in Kenya. A refugee child is not the same, a refugee girl who's 5 years old is not the same as a refugee boy who's 5 years old. So there are different overlaps, interconnectedness in terms of the identities that we have, the different identities that we have. And this interconnectedness of social categorizations create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage. So it's very important to consider the intersections even as we look at equity, because we are not all the same and we have different experiences, and how people react to us is different. We also need to understand that not all these groups of children have access to the same opportunities and quality of services. I've already referred to that. And their access may be denied to them because of discrimination, or they're excluded because facilities are simply not available or affordable. We also, an equity lens helps us to identify children at greatest risk, why they're excluded, and analyzes the structural determinants of inequity. In summary, the equity lens emphasizes or draws to our attention that one shoe does not fit all. And it also draws attention to the need to level the playing field. Next slide. Now, if we add a gender equity lens to it, and I think I don't want to spend too much time in this because Professor Hasina talked about some of the issues as it relates to gender.
Prof, as you proceed.
One of the things that...
Hello, Dr. Mahiu.
Sorry?
Just to mention that you have maybe 2 minutes to summarize.
Okay. So I will not go into this, into the sex and gender, but the differences that it is very important to recognize. And we take it for granted, but in the interactions with people, you find that there is, you know, we don't really know the difference between sex and gender. Let's just move on. And now we have, please move on to the next slide. And also there's that confusion between gender equality and gender equity and gender parity. So I will just take a second with this particular slide. Gender equality to me is the goal, what we're trying to achieve. It is more philosophical, more aspirational, that we, girls, women enjoy the same, not only girls, women, and with boys and men enjoy the equally the socially valued goods, opportunities, resources, and reward. But gender equity is the pathway to achieving gender equality, which is what we're trying to achieve. And gender parity has to do more with numbers. Are we equal? I mean, are we there in the same numbers? But that does not mean that we've achieved gender equality when we have gender parity. Move on. Please move on. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay. I was going to talk about the gender socialization and pedagogy and patriarchy and the enforcement of gender norms. I'll skip all that, but go to that, the gender, how it affects the child. It is also, one must look at the household, school, and community. Look at it holistically and the influences that it has on the individual child at the center, be it a boy, girl, or an intersex individual. So that there's an interplay of internal, external factors. And I'll go to my last slide. Please go to the last slide. So this is like, how do we embed gender equity? Actually, the 6 imperatives, I'll just read through them. That in order to embed gender equity, we need to look at the values. The values matter. What values do we have? Somebody earlier mentioned that, but using different words. There's been a lot of talk about policy, so we really need to look at the policies, look at them deeper into the policies, looking at, you know, how do you make the jump from, even if you have good policies, how do you make that jump from the policy to the practice? So that's very important. There's been a lot of talk about the contextual matters. That is another important, we have to do contextual analysis. Language matters and words matters, both the written word and the oral word. Because when you look at the language, that is really the channel of early socialization. And if we have to have a more equitable society, we must look at the language. What is it saying? What are the stereotypings that it is conveying? And then look at the training, application, and reinforcement matters, and looking at the overall workforce, early child care workforce, not only the teachers, but also looking at the workforce, but also looking at the policy, the training on gender equity and equity in general. And finally, monitoring matters. We must monitor to see that equity is actually being practiced and being integrated into the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Omahiu, for such a wonderful presentation, such in depth, but we want to apologize because time doesn't allow us to have you, take us through what you prepared for us, but we believe you're going to engage, you're going to have the slides shared, and we'll have more opportunity perhaps in the future to engage more on this. But we want to appreciate the issue that if you're going to achieve equity, we can borrow from the gender perspective and look at those 5 imperatives that you've mentioned, distinguishing for us between, equity and inequity, issues of gender parity, gender equality, and gender equity. Thanks for taking us through this. At this moment, I would like to bring the attention of our participants that we are going to have a poll question popping up on your screen. My colleague Dedan is going to pop up a question, which we are going to, take time to. We request each and every participant to take time to respond to the poll questions. We will be giving the responses to the poll questions and the results at the end of the Q&A that is just coming shortly after this. So just take a minute or two, a few seconds, 30 seconds to answer the poll that's given. My colleague Dedan will bring the results at the end. Even as we answer the poll questions, my colleagues, Kamasara and Judith, are going to bring a few questions that have been raised either in the Q&A or in the chat that we can bring to the attention of our participants. We will pick 1 or 2 questions because of time, so that we don't overrun the time allocation. I believe you have been able to submit our responses. So I want to ask my colleagues, Rose and Judith, just bring us a few questions from the chat or from the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. George. Our panelists, David, Professor Hasina, and Dr. Sheila, have been gracious enough. They've been responding to the questions as they were being asked. So we'll just read out the questions and the answers for our non-Anglophone speakers so that they can have the same information that we all have. So we had a question that was directed at Professor Hasina from Leonard, and he was asking, beyond policy into practice, how do females view inclusion of men in the care of children? Is it a threat to a promoted status quo and traditional comfort? And also, who must advocate more? Is it the male caregivers to demand more responsibility, or the female caregivers demand or invite more men into childcare? And the response that is submitted is that females do keep men out. The findings from literature show that the females perceive men as not being competent to deal with young children, the activities of bathing, feeding, and changing nappies. And then there's also a view of men as potential abusers of children. And so what we need is a gender synchronized approach for advocacy and for programming. A second question that was addressed to Professor Hasina, still on male engagement, was what percentage of mothers and fathers have the kind of formal employment that they would qualify for parental leave? And the response here is that there is tension between men in the formal economy and in the informal economy, and parental leave policies favor formal work. And this is a critical arena that needs to be explored further in the African context. Judith?
Thank you, Ruth. I'll read out some questions that were posted to David, which he has answered. Thank you very much, David. There was a question from Rachel Nyirasumi. She asked, how can we at the programming level be able to evaluate the economic returns from our programs? And this was the response. David gave them in point form. First, clearly identify your objective for the said analysis. Then make sure you have a medium. Choose which medium you want to use. For example, is it a policy note, cost benefit analysis, cost of inaction analysis, and so on. Third, you may want to identify key indicators to measure in your analysis. Fourth, you may consider identifying key sources of data and establish baseline expenditure. That is how much is being spent on child. When we say child health, we are focusing on 0 to 8 years, child supplementary feeding for the below 8 years children, and preschool. Lastly, they will need to indicate costs to be able to make a case for some spendings. Cornerstone's cost estimated will be helpful. We also had a question, how can we involve local NGOs in the system approach rather than replacing them with the strategic agencies, with the state agencies? David responded by saying, we'll need to do that by strengthening coordination and partnership mechanism based on shared vision and strategic plans, as well as leadership for coordination and policy for engagement. The goal is not to replace NGOs, but to integrate them into service provision to minimize duplication, strengthen service delivery, and ensure quality at scale. Rose, maybe if you have any other question, you can come in.
Okay, we have one question which has just been posted, which the panelists can respond to. What should be the core elements of male involvement in childcare? And that's it from the questions.
Thank you very much, Rose and Judith. Maybe I'll give Professor Hasina 30 seconds to respond to the question on what are the core elements of male involvement in childcare, but also to mention that your questions, you could also send them to us via email or continue posting them in the chat, but also you can engage with the presenters. Some of them have given their emails. We encourage them to give you their emails. They could also respond. So at this point, I'll give Professor Sina 30 seconds, and then my colleague Dedan will pick up from there. Professor Sina.
Thank you very much. Core elements, meaning the fundamentals. I think firstly, it is very important to recognize what image of men do you have when you are planning your, for programming, for policy and so forth. Because I found that there's a lot of assumptions based on who men are, what they can do, what their capabilities are, and so forth. So that the one core element I would say is to confront the assumptions that are associated with male competence. That's very important. And then the second one, then I think that's really a core component when you look at men's involvement in childcare, is to have a definitive idea around the approaches that are going to be used when you are doing, for example, programming. I've already mentioned the gender equity approach, but also the gender synchronized approach, meaning that, just as isolating men and bringing them to childcare sessions would be counterproductive for this kind of relationship building that you want to do. And then everything has to be grounded in a kind of a human rights framing, of which children's rights in the African Charter is embedded within it, with a multi-sectoral kind of response to men's engagement in the childcare. And the one other thing that I'd strongly advocate for going the systemic route is a multi-level response that begins from the daily realities of men to how they participate in communities, what the institutions do or don't do for them, and how the policy environment enables or disables them. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Professor Hasina. Thank you to all the presenters and for everyone who has participated in asking questions, and also our Q&A facilitators, and of course, Caroline Dusabe, who started us off. So now this is a bit of an icebreaker, just so that just before we go into the panel sharing session, As you can see on the screen, these are the poll results. So question one, you can see majority chose 100 times, the number of times a toddler laughs in a day. The correct answer, is actually 300 times. So about 24% chose that. So the number of times a toddler laughs in a day on average is 300 times. Another fun fact or interesting question we had was, which is not a component of the nurturing care. Seems that 96% of us are familiar with the nurturing care framework, which is good. And the answer is toxic stress. There's about 3% and 1% who thought of opportunities of early learning and responsive caregiving. Lastly, our last fun fact question was at age 3. Is a child's brain about 85% the size of an adult's brain? And the answer is true, that yes, a child's brain at age 3 is 85% of an adult's brain. So 92% got that correct. We have about 8% that chose false. So switching gears from our fun facts, just to kind of break the monotony, I'll invite Stella, who will moderate our next session, which is the panel sharing session. So Stella, over to you, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Dedan, for that warm invitation. Participants and panelists, we are shortly going to talk about very interesting issues from 4-country contexts. And I will be inviting each panel who's here today to just share firstly about what childcare initiatives exist in their context, and what all of us as child-focused actors in Africa can learn from them. Are childcares in your context regulated? Panelists, please paint the picture of caregiving arrangements for these young children, especially when their parents are away, either engaging in work or other duties. And the first panelist that we have is Joyce Marangu of AKU IHD, based here in Kenya. And Joyce is the project coordinator for scaling up playful parenting project at the Aga Khan University Institute for Human Development. She has previously been an African fellow as part of the second cohort, and she was previously a research associate at IHD. She holds an MA in development management from Ruhr University, Bochum, Germany. And she has an MA in development studies from the University of Western Cape in South Africa. Joyce, please highlight for us childcare practices in Kenya. Over to you, Joyce.
Thank you very much, Stella, and thank you all. It's a real honor to be in this webinar today, and thanks also for the great presentations that have come before. So building on that, I will paint a picture of the situation of the 0 to 3s in Kenya, and also respond to the question on who's taking care of these young children. So in Kenya, there are some estimates that say that 300 children below 4 years are at risk of failing to meet their developmental potential because of the conditions in which they live in. And these are primarily in urban informal settlements. When you look at the case of Nairobi, where a high population or a high percentage of the population is living in urban informal settlements. So there is a little bit of inconsistency in terms of the usage of daycare centers, because in some of the settlements, there is high utilization. For instance, a study by the APHRC in Mukuru showed that there is high usage of informal daycare centers, But a different study that was conducted by the Aga Khan University Institute for Human Development in Dagoretti, Roraka, and Jomvu in Mombasa County showed that there was low usage of daycare centers in those settlements. So I guess there is variation, and as a previous speaker has said, one shoe does not fit all. So we need to look at the situation in all of these areas to be able to determine a proper way forward. So we at the IHD conducted a telephonic survey within this COVID-19 period to determine how the childcare practices were in the urban informal settlements. And we found that the majority of the caregivers, a high percentage, about 74%, said that they spent more time with their children at home. And that is probably because of the curfews and loss of jobs, and that was associated with the COVID pandemic. And then, so some of them, just a few, were away from home. And when you look at their responses on who is taking care of the children, for the period that they were at home, the primary caregiver, who was most times the mother, was the one taking care of the child. And then we had the adult family members within the same household. So this could be a male partner, or it could be an auntie, uncle, or somebody else living within that household. And then the other option was neighbors and friends. So a low percentage, about 4%, said that a neighbor or friend was taking care of the child. And then for those who were not living with their children in Nairobi, they had left their children with grandparents. So we see that some of the literature before used to say that a lot of the parents in Africa are having their children taking, they're having the support of grandparents in taking care of children. But when we come to the data, it actually shows that grandparents are some of the the lowest percentage of carers we have in Nairobi in the urban informal settlements. So overall, the recent work is showing that kinship is slowly weakening in terms of childcare support for the parents within the informal settlements. And there is, variation in usage of paid childcare services because of, user fees. And then sometimes there are concerns that, the non-formal childcare centers are not well regulated. Sometimes there is poor ventilation, improper stimulation of children, improper nutrition, and all those challenges that are associated with those kinds of centers. So there's clearly a high need for systems and policies that support caregivers to take care of children. And this could include parental training, could include providing affordable childcare to enable the women to also be able to rejoin the labor market. And some of the other supports could be like social protection. So, and because workforce plays a big role in the provision of childcare, there is also need to look at what is entailed in the provision of quality early childhood development services. And I will just give a highlight of a different study that we conducted at IHD that was mapping the capacity building needs of the ECD workforce in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia. So primarily, there was capacity gaps at the individual, institutional, and systems level. I know that David has spoken about the systemic approach towards ECD. And so we did look at the individual, institutional, and systems level, and we're able to find that, a lot of at the individual level, there is not sufficient training for professionals, and people are not aware of very many good training opportunities. And even for the training opportunities that are available, they're not able to access them, for instance, due to costs. The ones that are offered online, we know the issues with connectivity, issues that we have in our context. So there are all these kinds of different challenges. There are also gaps in the skills. When you look at the individual level, the skills that the ECD workforce are in, the ones that are considered to be important. So for instance, communication skills, the participants also noted that counseling skills were critical. And then there is also, lack of inclusivity for children with special needs. And even aside from children with special needs, the ECD workforce itself that has, that has special needs are not facilitated to do their work well because of, poor regulation, poor infrastructure, for instance, in the ECD centers that are there. And so there is a perceived low regard also of ECD by the national and subnational government compared to other sectors. So people or our key informants who responded to this said that they would like to see a situation in which there is high regard for ECD, because this will translate into increased budgetary allocations for the ECD sector. So I think this paints a picture of the ECD, the childcare for children below 3 years.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I should move on to the next question or allow.
No, let's move to Sierra Leone before we come back to the final question. Thank you so much. And we agree that, kinship care has weakened greatly, and we need regulation of the childcare facilities. Let's see whether from Sierra Leone, the situation is different or similar. So I'll invite Hindolo Pokawa from Sierra Leone. Hindolo is the founder and executive director of Sierra Leone Foundation for New Democracy, which spearheads building local communities' capacities to see themselves as part of the solution to the problems that they face. He holds an undergraduate degree in political science and global studies with a minor in African American studies, focusing on peace and governance. He has a master's of liberal studies, for which he focused on literacy in mining communities in Sierra Leone. He's also a PhD student. So Mr. Hindolo, please share about a whole community approach to providing childcare services in village commodities, which is a different context from the urban centers that Joyce shared about in Kenya. Over to you, Hindolo. You have about 4 or 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Can people see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the work that I'm doing in Sierra Leone is coming from a grassroots perspective that really looks at how best do we look at all these huge macro systems and bring them down to a much more smaller levels to engage with communities in village settings. One of the, we decided to look at the question of approaching early childhood development from a grassroots point of view, using ecosystem that really supports, what are the community members saying? What are village people saying? What is it that they need? And how can they be part of that process to enable their children to engage in early childhood learning? And so our structure is very much not a top-down approach, but very much bottom-up approach, and looking at that to say, how do communities play a central role by being in the cooperative council to support various ways for children to be able to do well. And this whole idea came about from, when you look at the ecology, when you look at all faceted areas of having a child to be able to do well, providing the enabling environment for that, what David was talking about and other speakers who have mentioned, those enabling environments, one of those in Africa that is really being decimated is the ecology, is the environment. And we must be able to pay key attention to that. And so we had an intention to design our system that looks at the ecology, that looks at the community needs and environmental consequences as we embarked on this process. In 2014-15, we came up with this design where today we are having about 215 children who are supported with 2 meals a day, and looking at also that aspect of nutrition and what have you. And when we think about what the last presenter just mentioned, who take care of those children? What are the intentions of all of this? When mothers have to walk miles to take their children to the farm and they have to negotiate between feeding and childcare, that is not productive. Mothers are not able to do well in terms of being on the field. And I say mothers because they are the ones who are really involved in a lot of the work that is being done. And the professor had mentioned, how do we get male involvement into some of this work that we are doing? But these are the kinds of things we are talking about, providing a space for children to be brought so that they can develop their own skills. And so the holistic nature of providing a childcare services will have to take into consideration all sorts of things. And so we developed a kitchen that is smoke-free because there are more women dying in Africa from smoke inhalation, from malaria and typhoid combined. So the holistic area of looking at how folks are involved in early childhood, providing those services, the care, takes into consideration a lot of things. We have a story circle that we have developed to be able to engage in this kind of process where children can come and sit down and talk about their stories and so on. But we also took into consideration what were all of these elements to create an atmosphere for this particular conversation to take place. Teachers who otherwise will not have had an opportunity to go to the big cities to be able to engage in finding job which they will never find. We brought them together. We are able to provide training to be able to say, stay in your village. We, for instance, do not import any teachers. We work with training people who they have finished high school or not. We train them, take them through college. They have their diplomas and they are able to offer services in that nature. And again, developing these kinds of systems, you need a holistic approach. It's not just you bring them to school and they are not able to play. A right to play is a fundamental aspect of providing these kinds of services, and we pay attention to that very strongly. A graduation of our students this June clearly show how excited they are to finish preschool and get into first grade. Something that, 22% of Sierra Leone's budget goes to education. And we think that early childhood have very little to do with those kinds of resources. And so, this is part of our celebration for the graduation that we completed this June. But I also want to quickly mention something that happened last year, June, in Sierra Leone. We had a 5-year-old girl who was brutally raped and murdered. And that, threw everybody in arms and just thinking, what do we do? And, dealing with preschoolers, I decided to undertake a measure that was very much needed. When George Floyd was murdered in Minnesota, where I live, somebody walked 1,000 miles from Alabama to Minnesota to raise the awareness against police violence and brutality against Black men. I saw that. And when Khadija Sako, a 5-year-old girl, was raped, I decided that I'm going to launch a campaign to walk miles in Sierra Leone to raise awareness against gender-based violence for women and girls. I have a preschool, and this is my life's work. I decided that this work would be to honor and bring an awareness against sexual gender-based violence in Sierra Leone. A brother of mine, Dustin, joined me, and we walked 315 miles in January of this year, raising awareness, walking through the country, going through villages, towns, and cities, and talking about, the right for the girl child to be able to have access to education, to safety, to protection, and all the rest you can think about. At the end of that exercise, it became clear that this work of early childhood will have to take into consideration all of the faceted areas that support a holistic approach to providing male involvement initiatives that support their own understanding of participation in providing early childhood services. And so we will be undertaking this again, 520 miles coming up this November to December to raise awareness against these issues. And of course, this is something that is part of this whole broader umbrella of providing early childhood services. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hindolo, for sharing that very holistic way of looking at women's issues, women empowerment, and supporting women's economic empowerment. Before we ask you whether 023s are regulated in your context, we will move over to Ghana quickly in about 3 or 4 minutes. Vida of Ghana is the Executive Director, Street Children's Aid. She is on a mission to empower street children to become contributing members of their society. Vida is a seasoned social worker, project management professional, and has coached several NGOs, not only in Ghana, but other African countries. Gender activist, involved in the first census ever of street children in Accra, and she serves on several boards and government committees on children. She has, with her team, worked to promote issues of ECD for vulnerable children, especially connected to street families. She's a product of University of Ghana, holds a degree in social work, master's in project management, and is currently pursuing her doctorate from the Nobel International Business School in Ghana. Welcome, Vida.
Thank you, and thank you, participants, and all speakers for going forward ahead of us. Yes, in terms of what Street Girls Aid does with childcare, basically Street Girls looks at mothers who live and work on the streets. These are migrant women who have traveled, some from very far and near, to work in the cities of Accra. And for the lack of care service for their children, they will carry their children at the backs, or they leave their children with very small, their younger siblings, so that they can go and fend for money to be able to look after their children. So the idea of this project came when we realized that a lot of these children are really under security, safety-wise, they are very much, because they can be left by the roadside, and oftentimes if you don't take care, they can be knocked down by cars and all those things. So we came in to support these women so that at least they could have some peace of mind whilst they go about their daily schedule. Our facility takes care of children from 0 to 7. We say 0 to 7 because oftentimes children who are above 6 years may not have been to school at all. And if they are not able to get some preschool, they will not be able to progress to the primary school. So oftentimes we take children as old as 7 years to be able to prepare them so that we can integrate them into the regular school. Our system works like this. We have trained caregivers, we have trained social workers, because we see these children as just not needing just the education, but also other social aspects. So we work with the children, we work with the mothers, and sometimes we bring in also a clinical psychologist who works with them, so that these children, we know that they have been through a lot. They've been traumatized and other experiences that they have gone through. So they need some kind of care so that they won't be left like that. Every year, we are able to turn out roughly about 50 plus children to go to the mainstream school. So we follow the regular school calendar, and until COVID, we were bringing our children at September every year, where they will join the normal school. But because of COVID, this time it's going to be end of December, where children who are between 5 and 6 years have been prepared and then will be integrated into the regular school. Once they go to the regular school, we follow up on them once every term to see how they are faring. If they have issues in the school, we go home to talk to the mothers so that we'll see how best we can resolve the issues that they are facing. We also do a lot of work with the mothers and their spouses, because we are social workers, so we want to do more than just what a school system will do. So we also work with the mothers if they have issues with their spouses, or if they have issues at home, we work with them so that we would help resolve the issue. We do this because we see that the child needs a good environment to go in. So if we neglect that environment, then the child goes back home every day to more trouble. Whatever we do inside the center would not help. So we do a holistic thing. We also work with other government agencies. For example, we work with the Ghana Education Service, a special education unit. Children on the street, there's no facility for them if they are children with special needs.
Okay.
So we take our system also, our facilities also take them in. We have done a few trainings so that the teachers could at least have a basic knowledge of how to handle children with special needs. At the moment, I think we have about 10 special needs children in our 2 centers that we are taking care of.
That's very fascinating, Vida, from your context, and it's good that you're involving children with special needs, you're integrating families, and you're supporting street children to get access to school. Even if they haven't benefited from early learning, you are helping 7-year-olds, 6+-year-olds to be reintegrated, to be prepared for learning. So before we conclude the session, we'll invite Professor Moges from Ethiopia to share a bit about his context in 3 minutes. Professor Moges is an associate professor of linguistics at Addis Ababa University, the AU, and he served at the AU in different capacities over the past 20 years. Was a fellow of the Ethiopian Academy of Sciences and has published multiple articles, contributed to book chapters and proceedings. And he also served as international consultant with UNESCO ICBA on teacher motivation in Africa and digitalization, the future of work, the teaching profession in Ethiopia is also his forte, especially in the context of COVID-19. And he has been involved in the childcare studies in Ethiopia, for example, for AFCAN, and is currently the executive director of the Ethiopian Early Childhood Network, established this year. So Professor Moges, please share about the childcare legislative and policy environment in Ethiopia. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
An engagement.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you see my video? I can't see it. Thank you very much.
No,
sorry, say.
We cannot see your video, but we can hear you clearly.
It's muted, I think.
It's a great move for men to promote the well-being of children. Thanks for sharing your experience.
Professor, we can't hear you now.
It's not coming. Shall I continue? I couldn't find voice, I hope.
Yeah, we can hear
Can
you
hear me
now.
now?
Yes.
Thank you very much for this on childcare services. Just to go to your questions, based on the visibility study we conducted with Afghan, there's a project on childcare in Ethiopia sponsored by Afghan. Based on this study, generally, the major players in childcare services are network of families, neighbors, and community members. So, for instance, according to the study we conducted, 90% of the respondents in urban settlements have no access to childcare services, and left alone children or left without adult supervision are about 56% of the respondents. So childcare is not, childcare service is not in encouraging level because either it is totally absent or unaffordable. Since the majority of the population lives in the countryside, only about 20% are urban settlers. The majority of the people in the countryside do not have access to childcare services. Those in the urban settlements, especially the poor ones, the marginalized ones, have no access to childcare services. So the picture is not very impressive. On top of this, there is very little external assistance provided to caregivers. 63% of respondents said that they have not received any parental education, and 72% did not enroll their children in any form of early learning. And international partners working in this area mainly focus on safety net programs and facilitating orphanage for abandoned children. So home-based childcare services do not receive adequate support in terms of parental education, play materials, and early learning programs. Generally, childcare service is not sufficiently regulated. Top of this, there is a gap in skilled manpower. ECD workforce in Ethiopia is one of the most neglected area. The existing workforce has little, shit.
Dr. Moges,
it's disconnected, but I can use my mobile.
Not a problem. I think we are coming to the end of our panel session, and maybe one of us can share about policy making process in Dr. Moges?
Yes, yes.
Dr. Moges, we're coming to the end of our panel session now. And I think you have mentioned that, you know, the situation is not regulated in your context, and there's a lot of gaps in terms of skilled manpower, which we have seen the same for Kenya, for Ghana, and Sierra Leone. So maybe one of us can share a little bit on whether there's policy making in your context. I know that in Kenya it's happening right now, but is there policy making in your context, Moges, right now?
I can say a few things on this.
In 30 seconds.
There is a draft policy under review. Yeah, there is a draft policy under review to replace the old one.
Okay.
And we're also participating in this review process.
Okay.
But there are a number of things missing from the policy.
Yes.
The policy for silent or indifferent regarding childcare services. Maternity leave doesn't cover the women working in the informal sector. So there is lack of a complementary set of social and labor protection policies to fill this and other blind spots. There is a need to make care a central policy.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Moges. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you, every presenter from Kenya, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Ethiopia. We are very happy that you are able to make time to share with us. And we see that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of ECD policy making in our countries. So participants, please pay attention to your screen and fill in a simple survey. It will take only a few seconds of your time. And as you do that, I want to invite Mr. Kwesi Akwasam of the Association of African Universities. He's also the chair of the Knowledge Generation Working Group to conclude for us this meeting. Welcome, Kwesi Sam. Participant Sam serves in the Directorate of Research and Academic Planning at AAU. He's a human growth and development expert with diverse interests, particularly designing and implementing capacity development programs and projects for all categories of people. He has designed, implemented, and managed several capacity development programs and projects before joining AAU in 2016 as a project officer. He is equally interested in using technology to create platforms for higher education stakeholders to engage in topical issues pertaining to African higher education. This is fantastic. He produces and hosts the Prime television talk show, AAU Talks, and on AAU TV, the voice of higher education in Kenya. Kwesi Akwasam, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Stella, for the introduction. Good day, everyone. I am so much excited to be here. And anytime people find me involved in early childhood issues, they kind of ask, you are into higher education, why early childhood? And I get those questions a lot, but I keep telling them that the foundation of every phenomenon, every setup is very important. If you want to have a good structure, you need to pay attention to the foundation. And so if higher education is going to serve its purpose at the country level, at the regional level, and at the continental level, we cannot lose focus on early childhood development. That is very, very important. And throughout research, we've been able to establish the relevance of relevance of investing in quality ECD across countries and globally. And that is how come I am very much passionate at any opportunity that I get, even at the top level with professors and academics, and when I meet project managers, I try my best to really chip in the fact that early childhood education is important. So I always know that I am in the right place whenever I'm talking about ECD, because it is a passion as a humanistic person. But I want to this morning really thank AFCEN for providing this great platform and really projecting the work that we do as working groups for the ECD cluster. We are so much grateful and we appreciate the work that you do. You are just the bedrock that really fires the engine, pulls us along and conveys, and also make sure that we have topical discussions that really improves ECD space in our continent. And I think that you deserve that commendation. And we always hope that you'll be able to do that great job. My mentor, Professor Hasina, it's so refreshing to always sit and listen to you. I really, really loved the presentation that you made. And that has been one of the issues that I have been advocating at the country level in Ghana, especially as the executive director for the Early Childhood Network. We really need men or males in the space of ECD. And we cannot overemphasize that because of the relevance of that in our space now. David gave a very good perspective, and I have really, really enjoyed that presentation. And it gives me an overview, and I see that as a framework and benchmark indicators for even further research, and know how well we have come as a continent, how well we have come as member states. it gives an overview of how quality ECD delivery must be, and gives indicators of what we need to pay attention to. Government structure is very important. So as we leave this platform, I just want to throw a challenge to all of us as members, as individuals, as NGOs, as CSOs, as government officials. How are we approaching ECD delivery and care at the national level and at the regional level and also at the continental level? I like the fact that we had the opportunity to share some great works that individuals are doing during the panel session, the perspective of what is happening in Sierra Leone and what Vida shared from us, for us from Ghana, and what Joyce also gave us. These are crucial and innovative approaches that I think that we need to encourage more at the community level and also in our own individual space. So as we go back, these are some of the questions that, and these are some of the thoughts that I want us to further reflect on. How do we ensure that we have a systemic approach to everything that we do? Some few days ago, I was just reflecting who I wanted to design an intervention for the Early Childhood Network Ghana, and I've been reflecting who my dream Ghanaian child should be, or who my dream African child should be, and what it takes to really get that dream materialized. And I can, this webinar gives me so much insight that indeed, if we really want to achieve that, then we need to work together. There must be that effort of everyone, every stakeholder plays a key role. And I think that systemic approach is very crucial if we really want to ensure quality ECD on our continent. So quality childcare today in our context is no more a luxury, just as the person who opened the session mentioned. It is a necessity. And I hope that every stakeholder on this platform, in whatever capacity that you feel, you go back, reflect on the presentations that we've had today. I was clapping, I was tapping my feet and responding yes, yes, yes to most of the things that I've heard today. And I believe that we are on a right path as a continent. We want to encourage ourselves wherever we find ourselves, at the country level especially. Let us keep drumming. Let us ensure that we have quality leadership for ECD, creating strategic partnership and coordination, and creating awareness of the fact that if we really would want to see our continent develop, we need to pay particular attention to ECD. And I think everyone on this platform is very vital to that campaign. And the ultimate goal is that no child must be left behind. So I want to thank our participants for joining us today. I believe that you continually spread this good news that we've had today and keep the work going so that when we gather again, we will have good results to show. So on behalf of AFCAN, on behalf of the working group, we want to say thank you to everyone who has joined us, to our section moderators. You've been very fantastic, and we wish you all the best, and we hope that we keep doing the good job and produce more results to project the quality image of what we want to see in our children in a few years to come. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kwesi, for that. I think that concludes our webinar. So I want to appreciate everyone who's come, and nothing more to add on to Kwesi's closing remarks, but to thank everybody and wish everybody a good day, good evening, good night, good morning for those in the US. But from AFCAN, thank you so much.